Welcome to Mott MacDonald's podcast, Nature Positive, the Inside Story. In this podcast series, our host Julia Baker will be talking to industry leaders and experts about nature-related policy, advisory, law, and much more. In today's episode, Julia sits down with Amelia Woodley to discuss what nature means to an ESG director. So don't forget to subscribe and, most importantly, enjoy this episode.
Amelia, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast.
Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, it's lovely to see you.
Nice to see you too.
You now work for Speedy Hire.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe Speedy?
So Speedy is the UK's largest tool and equipment provider, predominantly to the construction infrastructure sector, but we also support kind of regional construction companies, trade and retail outlets as well. But you think about those big infrastructure construction projects like High Speed 2, for example, we provide all the tools and equipment to those type of projects.
So you're the ESG director.
Correct, yeah.
What do you do for a job?
That's a really great question. It's very varied. So my role essentially covers all of the environmental and social initiatives for the business. So if you think about climate change, net zero, energy reduction, nature, water efficiency. And then when we look at the social value element, we're moving away from a space of your traditional kind of charity and community engagement into like inclusive recruitment and social mobility, social hiring. So look at supporting underrepresented groups in the community into employment. So a big focus around the social value element. But the new part of kind of the ESG role, which is a bit different to your kind of traditional sustainability director, is the governance. So I look after sustainability governance for the business. So this is all our disclosures and our ratings. This is all around business transparency and ethics, corporate governance, ESG linked remuneration, data security and privacy. So there's a whole kind of governance element to that role as well. That is essentially kind of the solid foundations that uphold the environmental and social pillars.
There's a lot of talk that investors, so people who would buy shares in your company, look at ESG equally as well as return on investment. Are you seeing that?
Absolutely. So I don't think it's probably got to the equal part yet, but it's definitely moved up the agenda. So if you think, I've been in the industry for about 22 years, even I would say 5 years ago, there wasn't much interest from an investor point of view, which was always one of those struggles in sustainability of getting that kind of financial commitment. Then the investors are definitely looking at ESG. It's very dependent upon the investor and what their core principles and values are. But at Speedy, even in the last few months, we've had investor houses reach out to us, have asked us about our ESG agenda, have done their own scorecards against us.
So they're scoring your ESG?
Absolutely, yeah. So they'll look at our performance from an ESG perspective. So they will look at all public information out in the public domain. They use something called a HALT database, where most of the investors will use this HALT database, which essentially scores you on your ESG performance as a business. One of the disclosures that we run called the ISS disclosure, 84% of our investors will look at that disclosure in terms of our ESG performance. We're a prime rated status under ISS, and that's really important because if you're prime status, you go up in the fund manager listings. So the conversations from the investors are significantly different to what they were years ago. And we're starting to see now more investors asking more questions. It was really interesting because we actually had a chat with one of our investors recently where they presented their scorecard to us, which we had a look at and had a bit of a discussion and debate around it. And whilst, financial performance and return will always take priority, they've definitely said that one of the reasons why they've invested in Speedy is because of our ESG performance as an organisation. That conversation wouldn't have happened over 5 years ago. So it's
a fast-moving space, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
I think it's really interesting because you get a lead in when legislation changes. But when investors, that's faster and you need to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if I reflect upon my journey over the last 3.5 years at Speedy, what we've seen from the investor space, was questions around net zero. So that was
Right.
huge. Do you have a net zero commitment? Do you have science-based targets? What's your carbon data for scope 1, 2 and 3? So 3 years ago, we started to see those questions. So, that signals to you they're interested in climate and carbon. Then we started to get more noise around the modern slavery and human rights movement. And we've actually seen more questions in the disclosure over the last year around that particular risk. But now you're starting to see the trickle in of biodiversity really subtly. So things like, do you have biodiversity assessments of your depot and operations? What's the biodiversity risk of your supply chain? Are you aligned to TNFD regulations? So they'll talk maybe around biodiversity, they might talk nature, they might talk natural capital. It really depends on how that investor devises that scorecard. But you're starting to get little signals from the questions that they're starting to kind of pry into those nature impacts now.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, if you look at behavioural change,
Huge.
it's like we need the toolkit, we need the legislation, absolutely. But obviously, as a hire company, biodiversity again doesn't, it's not like you're building something.
Yeah.
So for you, the fit is with nature-related disclosures,
Yes.
and we'll certainly touch on nature positive. But you mentioned Mark Carney. Was that a real standout moment for ESG in general? And what was it exactly?
So my personal opinion is I think it was. And it goes back to my, the comment I made earlier, and I'm sure you'll share this view. How many times have sustainability people knocked on boardroom doors looking for money and budget, a seat at a table, a discussion point? It's been really hard. And I think for sustainability people, they've really had to either drive it through a legislative perspective, or if you're in a major infrastructure project, it's usually come through down by planning regulations and, development consent orders and things like that. So, we've never really had a natural in. And if you think about the sustainability world, the only way you're really going to get leverage is if the flow of money shifts. And that flow of money shifted in the investor market when those TCFD regulations came out, because what those TCFD regulations did was they were asking the investors to look at where was the climate risk and opportunity in that business. And they assessed that risk and opportunity in terms of whether they want to invest in you as an organisation. A couple of years later, you had, Larry Fink at BlackRock went very big on ESG, and that's kind of been sort of reeled back because of what's happening in the United States around the whole ESG movement. But for me, my opinion is if you want to integrate ESG into businesses and for it to be successful, that flow of money and capital needs to talk to those subject matters. And you're starting to see that through the investor community. You're getting signals from the UK, with the previous government and even, our new Labour government. They want the UK finance sector to be the biggest green finance sector in the world. And investors are saying that there's trillions of capital that can be unlocked into sustainability-backed businesses and projects. That conversation wasn't happening 10 years ago. It wasn't. It
5 years ago.
Yeah, it wasn't on the board agenda because the investors were not putting pressure on the PLC board around these issues, and these disclosures weren't there. So I think that regulation shifted the view of investor risk. And then there was a really great quote from one investor a few weeks ago, and I've forgotten the name of the particular investor house, but they say ESG risk is investor risk. So when they look at a business, they would do all the normal, checks and balances in terms of, finance, return on investment, all that element of the due diligence. But they're looking at ESG as a risk and as an opportunity as well. And that's a huge shift for the sustainability agenda.
I think it is. And I think it relates to, though, what we're now seeing. Like, this is nature's moment now. I mean, you and I have worked in this business for a long time. Back in the day, we were piloting biodiversity net gain, on the Thameslink programme. But that was still kind of project level, whereas now nature's that discussion in the executive boardroom. What does that discussion look like? So what is a discussion about nature in the executive boardroom from your experience? What does that need to be and what should it be?
Yeah, so I think it's an evolving sort of shift in language. So, and to speak from my perspective, it's been a huge shift in how I've had to sort of communicate with boards as well. So if you think about, when we would build business cases, it was looking at what was the payback? Was it going to cost me any additional money? Could we do it for no cost? Or, you get some kind of payback at the end. And that's really hard for sustainability because you've got to be looking at long-term investments, whole life costs, which could come back in 20 plus years, but your project is 5 or 6. So it was always really hard to build that business case. And there was always that narrative sustainability costs money because it does short term. When we think about then the TCFD regulations and the TNFD regulations, they talk about 4 things. They talk about, is that sustainability impact embedded in your business strategy? So the connection of a sustainability strategy into a business strategy is absolutely critical. And that's the holy grail, really, isn't it, for any organisation, that your business strategy is a sustainable plan. It then looks at, do you have core governance structures set up to understand and communicate and manage and monitor all those risks and opportunities from a sustainability perspective? And this is outside of having a sustainability working group that's championed usually by the sustainability leader of a business. This is governance at PLC and executive level.
I just want to highlight the difference between the token gesture and it was like a stepping stone, back in the days, and we still have them, they're like the champions, like the office champion for recycling, things like that. But we do have to move on.
Absolutely. And I think that governance structure has really changed that narrative because we've all worked, as you've said, Julia, in working groups that are sat on the sideline, attended by really ambitious, positive, enthusiastic people. You might be lucky to get an executive or senior leader representative to pop along to a couple of them, a few times a year. But now it's all around, is that nature impact, that sustainability impact embedded through a proper governance framework? Then it talks about, do you have targets? And are those targets smart? Are they embedded within your organisation? Do you have people identified from a roles and responsibilities perspective who are accountable for delivering those targets? And do you have KPIs that will measure performance of those targets and track continual improvement? So you're going from a place of, if we talk specifically about nature, because that's why we're here today, you're going from a place of doing something that's very philanthropic, maybe, so tree planting, or something that's driven by regulation, so, ecology, wildlife regs, into embedding nature into a business. And that conversation has had to shift into talking about managing business risk. So what is the risk to my organisation from nature? And what's the opportunity as well? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be negative. It can be a positive opportunity for an organisation. Will nature impacts open up or close revenue lines to us, which affect the commercial success of our business? Could there be any brand reputation to us in terms of greenwashing or negative coverage that affects our brand position and our corporate name? They're completely different conversations to what we've had before. And we've really had to think about, when we talk about sustainability, we've had to think about, okay, it's about risk management, not just in the organisation, but through the value chain. Because my role as a sustainability director is to help manage the risk of the business. It's about generating revenue. So how can I position the business in a way where we can win work and drive revenue and growth, which then increases your share price and is a return on investment to your shareholders? So those conversations are now intertwining and interlinking with each other. And we've really had to reposition that whole piece to get boards to understand why nature has a place at the board table. And that was so different to what it was years ago.
I know. What's really interesting about the reputation piece that you said? There's a reputation risk of being silent, of not being part of the nature movement as well. So I think sometimes people think, I'm just going to wait. It's too risky. We don't know what this thing is. But actually not being part of the nature voice. And, you might have missed that investor, or you might have missed, the customer sales or something like that. So it's finding that place where it's a careful talk about nature in terms of your business. You're not putting yourself at risk by promising too much, or, the uncertainties, but you're not also missing the boat.
It's a balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's that whole debate of greenwashing and green hushing. And there's so many terms now. I think, as an organisation, if you want to continue to be commercially successful and you want to drive revenue, you have to stay ahead of those topics. And for us as a business, we use the investor voice and the disclosures as signals to where we think the markets are moving. So if they're asking about something around nature, we know eventually that conversation is going to come. So it would not make good commercial sense for us to sit on that conversation and not move forward. We have to be building it behind the scenes. Now, there's always a debate around, how public do you go? I think if you've got robust frameworks and you've got your metaphorical house set up, there shouldn't be any worry about going public. But at the same time, I do really understand and appreciate why organisations are concerned, because, you have the whole movement around over-promising and under-delivering, greenwashing, etc. So I think it's a delicate balance of what's your company's appetite for being vocal and visible. It's very different to actually maybe you just quietly build behind the scenes. And that's something, for example, Speedy Hire have been doing for a very long time. We, if I think about our net zero journey, I think about our strategy with Decade to Deliver, we quietly built for 2.5 years behind the scenes, getting our house in order before we went public with any statement. Or any early adopter commitment. And when we went public, we were confident that we had those solid foundations. And it goes back to that conversation earlier around what's ESG. The governance bit's so important, right? And investors are interested in governance. And governance is around getting your basics right, being brilliant at the basics, getting your foundations in place. Because that's what gives you the security. So if you do go out with a public statement, you know that you've got all of your frameworks in place behind the scenes. So there's nothing wrong in building quietly behind the scenes and going out when you're ready.
Yeah. When you say governance, though, to really unpack that, what exactly do you mean?
So for Speedy, governance for us means a multitude of different things. So for example, do we understand what regulation and disclosures and policy is on the horizon to us? There's so much change in the regulatory market and the financial markets and the investor markets, even like government policy. So as a business, we have a responsibility to ensure that we understand what's coming on the horizon to us, because we can't get caught out. And that's why things like being an early adopter to TNFD, yes, it's because we want to make our statement on nature, but what the early adopter view does for us, it allows us time to prepare rather than getting caught in the change, because that's the hardest thing.
Yeah.
And getting caught in that change is very reactive and it's very costly. And you don't ever want to be in a place where you have to do a comply or explain statement. You want to be in a place where you can go, I've got my disclosure and I've been building it for 2 years. So it's about that horizon scanning. It's about making sure then once you've got your horizon scanning that you've got solid compliance to all those regulations and policies. You know what they are, you know the impact that has on your business, and you know how you'll respond to it. And one of the things that we've done at Speedy is something called an ESG double materiality assessment. And what a double materiality assessment does is it looks at what's your ESG risks and opportunities. So your impacts as a business on the outside world and the impacts of the outside world on your business. That's really key for investors. And if we think about the CSRD regulations coming in, they want double materiality assessments. So we've done that. We know our 15 ESG risks. we know our top 5. And by having our top 5 risks, we are able to focus effort. And if you think about the sustainability arena, one of the things that people will say is, there's so much. I've got to look at nature and water and energy and climate and social value and communities. I don't know where to start. And what the double materiality assessment does is enable you to laser focus where your ESG issues are. Once you laser focus, you can put your time and your resource and your budgets into that. If you can get your top 5 ESG risks aligned and have appropriate controls in place, then most organisations are going to be successful. And what we found with the materiality assessment is our risks were the same as our stakeholders. So we had complete alignment. The things they were worried about were the things that we needed to be worried about. So if we can go through and manage those risks for ourselves, and by therefore default our customer, it makes us more commercially attractive. So it's about that risk management framework. And then that flows down, Julia, into the value chain and how you manage that through the value chain. And the output of that then is having robust KPIs that you report on and that you're transparent, because governance is all around transparency as well. And the investors are looking for more around transparency of risk as opposed to a disclosure that says everything is fine.
Gosh,
Transparency is key. Trust is key. And people are frightened to be fully transparent sometimes. You know
what? I'm so glad you made that point, because we're doing a number of presentations to executive board, and I was chatting away to someone and she said, Julia, always tell the board what the risks are.
Correct.
Never tell them that everything's perfect, because they won't believe you.
Yeah.
And that's the same as with investors. Absolutely.
So they'd rather know than not know. And if you say no, then it's either because it's there and you've not fully declared it, or you're not looking.
Yeah.
So, and that's a real mind sort of shift change of going from a place of, not sure I should say anything, because that would then turn an investor off, to how much do I say that gives them confidence that we are, going back to what I've said before, managing the risk. All they're looking for, are you managing the risk? You know where it is, and are you managing it on our behalf?
Yeah, and I think that's important, because something like, modern slavery is systemic. We're just operating in a system, and we absolutely, and I really love the work that you've been doing on it, actually. I think it's fantastic. So it is about progressing as a society, but the risk is there. Absolutely. It's not like it's just for Speedy. You're working within a system where that risk is apparent.
And there's always risk in an organisation.
Yeah.
And it's about knowing what it is, where it is, and how you manage it. You can't eradicate these issues. And
we can't do it overnight.
We've always said with sustainability, there's always a trade-off, and we've spoken about that many times over our work together. You think about the biodiversity world, there's always a trade-off. And it's working out what that trade-off is and what the risk of that trade-off is to the business. There's no right answer. And that's why it goes back to, my comment earlier that ESG risk is investor risk. So it's all about risk management. But the opportunity side then is around how you can unlock revenue.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing in my tenure as a sustainability expert is the first time ever ESG unlocking revenue. So it's been a bit of a kind of this unknown quantum that, does it really actually drive sales? Will it win you work? It might contribute, it might not. It's never been the driving force. I've always said it's the thing that might tip a decision over the edge. But what we're seeing through public procurement, for example, is that ESG is moving the dial between a business winning work and not winning work. And one of the key elements for a business being successful at winning work is governance.
Yeah.
Confidence in the governance framework.
To bring this specifically for nature, though, if you asked me about the value of nature years ago, I would have talked about bees and pollinators. Do you remember?
Yeah.
And that conversation was so great.
Yeah.
Like, suddenly it was all about the bees and the pollinators. And I loved that, because it brought it home to us as a community that we're so connected. We're so connected to the bees and the pollinators and the food systems and everything. But now the conversation about nature, if you ask me right here, right now, the conversation about the value of nature is one of materiality. You know, nature's material to your business, is material to our economy, is material to us as society. How do we answer that question, though, specifically for nature?
That's a good one. You know, and I think it goes back, you know, just reflecting back what you've said, it's material to the business. Businesses can't survive without understanding what their impacts on nature are. If you think about the climate debate, you know, years ago, people didn't believe in it. Now, most people do, and there are frameworks in place to manage it. And the nature journey is exactly the same. It's moving it from a place, Julia, of being a nice tree planting activity with a community engagement photo under my CSR banner into actually business decision making. So businesses can't commercially survive in the future unless they understand the risk and opportunity that they present towards nature as equally as towards climate. What's interesting about the debate is the two not interconnecting just yet. Okay. So I think we've been on this journey where we kind of get the climate debate, we get the TCFD regulations, everyone's looking at climate risk, we've got the transition plan task force, lots of investors now, and even recently at our half-year AGM, one of the questions that we had pre the AGM was, do you have a climate transition plan aligned to a 1.5? Wasn't asked that 2 years ago. But no one's quite asking for the nature plans just yet because they're being dealt with in silos. Now, maybe they're being dealt with in silos, Julia, because it's easier to manage conversations separately. When you start to entwine these topics, they become quite convoluted and complicated for people to unpack. But the two can't exist without each other.
Yeah.
And they go hand in hand. And that's what we're trying to do around our work at Speedy is, okay, we've done a lot of work around net zero and climate change, around our compliance and our regulation and setting our industry leading targets and really pushing the boundaries on that, shifting all of our kits, all our investment now in clean technology. There's been a huge amount of work done on that, and it's absolutely the right thing to do, and it's supporting all of these construction and infrastructure projects out there with net zero objective. But we need to have the nature conversation of
and you
that.
certainly are. We published the Nature Positive plan, and you are signed up to the TNFD early adopters.
Yes.
Which is fantastic to see. Are your customers asking about nature?
Absolutely. It's quite interesting because I did a little analysis last week around our customers' net zero commitments, and you know, not surprisingly, all of our top 10 customers have a net zero commitment, but they've also got nature ones, every single one of them, in different guises. So it might be a 10% biodiversity net gain, it might be nature positive, it might be nature science-based targets, it might be, you know, some had nature in design, but they've all got something in there. And that's really interesting because, again, if you know, we reflect back on the infrastructure and construction sector, it was always in the background, a rumbling, but no one had any really solid targets and objectives around it. We all knew we had to do something with nature. We never had any real mandate to do it. And now our top 10 customers all require some form of nature or biodiversity commitment to their organisation, but also that trickles down to us because we sit in their value chain.
And we talked about biodiversity net gain and then nature positive. How do you describe the differences?
So for me, they're quite different in the sense of, if I can talk from a Speedy Hire perspective, because we really had to find our way in this nature journey. And obviously, you know, when I reached out to you to help us on it, my question was, well, we don't really have an impact. We're not building anything. We can't contribute to the biodiversity net gain conversation. We can't give 10% back because we're providing equipment. And obviously through the work that we've done together, it's been that evolution of actually understanding that our impact was more around the nature positive movement. So the decisions that we were making as a business and what impact that had on nature. If we go back to things like eco-kit, investing in eco-kit for net zero, is there an unintended consequence of that from a nature perspective? And obviously we've looked at things like Sustainable Battery Alliance and how we expand that out into the nature movement. Looking at then our supply chain, what's their impact in that nature journey, and how do they align? Because for me, I've really got, one of my roles is to support the customer, because by supporting the customer, I help the business to be commercially successful. And if the customer is signalling, I have a commitment on biodiversity and I have a commitment on nature positive, then where does Speedy Hire fit into that jigsaw puzzle? And that's the journey that we're exploring at the moment. We've obviously launched our nature positive roadmap by 2030. We've set our principles out, again, very much aligned around TNFD, around baselining, governance, initiatives, metrics, etc. And it's really exploring, where do we fit within that journey? We may not have a massive direct impact in terms of, the type of organisation that we are, but we have some form of impact, and it's figuring out what that is. We also have a requirement as a business to make sure that we're climate resilient. You only have to look at the news last week around all the flooding that's been happening in the UK and the detrimental impact that has on people's lives.
I was thinking about you because what happens? The roads stop.
Your business can't run.
No, you distribute.
Yes, we are in some respects a logistics operation.
Yeah.
So if we think about extreme weather,
massively impact
huge
distribution.
Huge, and to unpick that a little bit more, when you think about climate, a lot of people think about transition risk. So what's your risk from a transition perspective in terms of, like, for example, the assets that we hold? So fossil fuel assets is a transition risk, which is why we invest in clean tech, to drive revenue for the customer, but also to manage that transition risk. What's probably not as well sort of explored is the physical risk. So, if you think about heat waves, 2 years ago, I think it was, when we had a 40-degree heat wave.
In London.
Yeah, I mean,
it's unheard of.
It was incredibly uncomfortable. I had to work in my bathroom for about an hour because it was so hot, But I
didn't get that far.
Yeah, these things affect people's ability to work, So if you think about properties, you have to design a property to have optimum heating and cooling.
Yeah.
So that heat waves don't affect people's ability to work in the operational aspect. And it's the same with the vehicles, cool electric vehicles that people can continue to move around in that heat wave. So there's a whole well-being thing around it. But if you look at the flooding, it can, you've got a whole business continuity risk there. So then how can nature, in the design of our physical assets, help us be more resilient to climate change in the future? And again, we don't know the answers yet. And I think, in this journey, it's really important, to be honest, we don't have all the answers, but we're trying to explore it and say, we know it's getting hotter, we know it's getting wetter, we know that's a risk to our ability to operate our business. So how do we look at nature through an operational lens of keeping the business running, but also that impact through the value chain?
I know. What was really interesting for me, though, when we're looking at that conversation, and you got over 200 depots across the UK, and there are some depots that are doing fantastic work about biodiversity, and they want to increase biodiversity on their land. And I was like, well, if we increase biodiversity in and around your depots, can we do so in a way that helps strengthen the resilience of the depots to climate change? And that was like the magic spot in the middle, where you move from the initiatives of some of your staff who were like really into biodiversity and brilliantly so, to make that enhancement of nature valuable to your business. And that's a, big thing to do. It's not a couple of trees around the corner, but nature can help you be more resilient.
It can, and I think, resilient not just from a climate perspective, but from a people perspective as well.
Yeah.
So, if I reflect back on our Milton Keynes Innovation Centre, we launched that centre and we essentially put 3 properties into one. So these were 3, properties that come to, that they sort of come to their age in life in terms of building perspective. And we wanted to create a really sustainable innovation centre, which would be the blueprint of what the Speedy property estate would look like. So we brought 3 buildings into one centre. We put a wellbeing garden at Milton Keynes, so wildflower planting, nothing fancy. And there were bird boxes and there were habitats for squirrels, and one of the depot gentlemen has built a fish pond. So that kind of little wildlife garden has taken on its own sort of kind of growth over the last few years. But it's so important from a well-being perspective, because you think these depots are operational depots, they're in industrial estates that are traditionally lots of concrete and hard standing. They're not in the centre of London with lots of facilities and, Canary Wharf, natural spaces, natural gardens now. So it's their little bits of wildlife and their little sanctuary in an industrial estate. When we ran a survey of people at Milton Keynes, we did a socio-psychological sort of survey where we asked 5 really basic questions. Are you happier at work? Do you feel you have more purpose? Do you get on better with your colleagues? Yeah. 95% of the response was yes, because they were working in a nicer depot that was clean, optimal heat and cooling. They had a place to go to have lunch in the summer that had wildlife. There's lots of jokes in Milton Keynes around all of our squirrels. We have resident squirrels and a woodpecker and all sorts, but that's become their little haven.
Yeah.
And I believe that having a better place to work, which includes nature, and it doesn't have to be hugely expensive, just makes the working environment a little bit nicer for people. Now, if you link that back to what investors are looking at, one of the things that investors are particularly interested at the minute is people's mental well-being in the workplace. And this falls under the whole workers' rights element.
Right.
So how are businesses managing mental well-being in the place, because it's a risk to investors? Those subtle little projects, nature projects, just doesn't have to be big.
No, exactly. I think the magic of Milton Keynes, though, it was the staff initiated it, so they had such ownership of it. We've had a couple of conversations with them.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like head office came down and built it for them. And I think that's part of it, isn't it? Because it was they talked about it being their nature.
Yeah, they own it, they manage it, they've built their own fish pond. It's theirs, and it's that ownership side of things.
One thing you mentioned, to touch on, coming back to the supply chain. So something when we think about nature positive, we're tracing the impacts on nature back through the supply chain. And I'm worried that we're going to ask them and they're like, you're up there, but it might be like, you are kidding me. You're asking me about carbon and you touched on this. You asked me about modern slavery. Now you've got nature on my plate. And I think it's a way of making sure that if you do good things for net zero, it can be positive for nature. So it's a way of linking it together, which comes back to your point. Where do you see your supply chain with this, I guess? And I mean, a Speedy, you're in that place where you're leading that conversation with nature. Is it like a gentle introduction?
I would say so. Yeah, we've started the conversation around carbon and net zero. So that's a big conversation we've unlocked with 300 suppliers. Nature can be quite complicated for some. So I think
not immediately apparent.
No, and it's also quite vast. I think it's a conversation that will come very slowly for us, we've got a number of priorities with the supply chain. The first is around the net zero and carbon space. We've done a lot of work as a business to make sure we're in a leadership position. We now have a responsibility to understand where the supply chain is and to guide them through that process. You know, it's really important to know 60% of our supply chains are SMEs. They are not geared up for this. Some of them are, and actually some SMEs are absolutely brilliant. So we really have to think about how we tackle it. So our first priority is net zero and carbon. Our second priority is modern slavery and human rights. And then our third is nature. What we're trying to do, Julia, is intertwine conversations where they fit. So if we think about the kit, we are investing in a lot of battery technology, which is really great for net zero. So now what we're starting to do is saying, okay, we know that has a really positive net zero impact. What's the impact on modern slavery and human rights? How much transparency do we have in that global supply chain where we procure those pieces of kit from? Is there a nature impact? So we're not intending to go out and say you must be nature positive by 2030 like us. What we're saying is there something there that we don't know that we should know? And if there is, then what is it and how do we work together to manage that risk?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to touch up on. Firstly, you're so right to ask those questions because the risk is that we think we're making progress when we're not. You know, we think we're making progress net zero because we see the emissions coming down, but somewhere along the line, the switch to some other technology has that impact on nature. So we're just chipping away at the natural environment, you know, and I think it comes back to your point about what are the trade-offs and let's make that informed decision making. Secondly, working with SMEs is so important, but they don't have the resources.
Mm-hmm.
And balancing that and just being mindful of that's that careful conversation, but also we don't have time to wait.
Absolutely. And that's a really important point that you've raised because, yes, it is a careful conversation and we're not in the market to make things difficult for the value chain. It
Not
won't
at all.
work. However, there is a point in time where that conversation has to be less voluntary. There's a lot of noise at the moment around supply chains and SMEs, and there is noise in the right places. But my view, I think the supply chain have 2 years tops to adapt. And the reason I say that is because if we are getting this downstream pressure from investors, from government, from customers, but if the supply chain doesn't adapt with us, it affects our ability to work with those asset owners. So we have a responsibility to make sure that the supply chain adapts quick enough for us to continue to work with our customers and deliver our velocity growth plan, which is doubling the size of our business. So the supply chain is absolutely critical to us and is a risk.
Yeah.
And we're starting now because I do believe there's about 2 years that we've got to get people aligned.
It's a really interesting way. I mean, it truly is your value chain, isn't it, when you look at it like that?
Absolutely.
About taking that forward.
Yeah.
Amelia, thank you. Is there anything important we've not yet discussed?
Oh, I don't think so. I think, you know, through this conversation, it's when we think about climate and nature, it's the marrying up of those two topics. How do we deliver net zero and nature positive together rather than what can feel at times two very separate, distinct work streams? So for me, I'm really keen to see where this conversation goes and how can we deliver a nature positive project that also helps us achieve our net zero goals at the same time.
Before we go into our final questions, there's something I'd like to ask you. Back in the day, you said yes. You said yes, you're working on Thameslink.
Yeah.
And I was trying to pilot, you know, biodiversity net gain in the metric.
Yeah.
And I went to see so many people and you were the one that said yes. I've always wondered, I mean, we kind of just went for it. Why did you say yes?
It'd be no fun if you said no, would it? Oh, I think that's just my personality more than anything. I've been in sustainability for such a long time, and for me, the thing that is joyous to my job is pushing the boundaries. I've always been really open, Julia, that businesses are here to make money and we should never shy away from that honest fact. And that can be really hard sometimes in the sustainability world. But how can we help businesses be commercially successful through being better in terms of better for the planet, better for society, better for business? And I love that journey of working with organisations where you start off with very little and you go through that whole growth curve of, let's do it, push the boundaries, have the difficult conversations. And when you get to that place where you can look at an organisation, I look at Speedy, EcoVadis Platinum, CDP A-, Financial Times European Climate Leader 2023-2024 in 3.5 years. And that's because we said yes. And we don't get it right all the time, and it can be hard. But, there's growth on the other side of fear. So just say yes. It might work, it might not, but you had a go. And I think anyone that gets in the sustainability job is in that job because they really care. So for me, there is no option, because why would you say no? Because that would be quite a depressing place for a sustainability consultant, a sustainability professional to live in a place of no. So,
well, it was the best yes.
Say yes and see where it ends up.
So to finish off, there is a lot about this is nature's time, and thank you so much. I think a lot of the conversations about nature are about nature, but you've dived into the conversation we need, which is about nature in the boardroom. From your personal perspective, though, what is your greatest fear about this time for nature? Because it feels like we can really make ground. But what are you most worried about, and how do we tackle that?
I think there are two things which I've vaguely touched on. I think the disconnects. So you have climate, you have nature, you now have a disclosure coming out around people and equalities. They're all interconnected. Okay, so climate and nature are interconnected. Inequality and well-being and, social value is interconnected. And my fear is that these subject matters stay siloed. And when you think about, carbon credits and carbon offsets, it's all about carbon. And then you look at nature and it's accounted for in a different way. It's stacked in a different way. And in the middle of it, Julia, you've got people, right? The climate regulations, the TCFD regulations, not once mentions people. Not once. Nature doesn't mention people. Businesses and societies are run by people. And these conversations are not knitting together. And that's my fear. What my biggest excitement is, how could I deliver a nature project or nature projects that tackle issues like climate resiliency and flooding, right? We're an island, we're surrounded by water, there's lots of nature water projects. How could I deliver a nature project that achieves my organisation's net zero goals, that delivers nature back from decline, and that supports people's well-being, particularly in areas of social deprivation?
Yeah.
So how could I tie those three narratives together to get maximum impact at the lowest possible, let's be honest, commercial investment point? And I think when you decouple all of these conversations, you're missing the point.
I think you're right. You're also, it's also more costly.
Hugely costly. I have to offset for carbon. I have to do credits for nature. It's hugely costly for an organisation, and it's quite frightening. But sometimes we have to get to the purpose of what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep global temperatures at 1.5. We're trying to stop the decline of nature. And we know we have a mental health crisis. why are those three conversations not married together? And that's my fear.
And that's the place where to be.
Yeah, it's not connecting. It might do, but at the minute we're having to look at things through very separate tunnels, and that can be complicated and it can be expensive.
You have had the most extraordinary career, and it's been so brilliant working with you. But I'm interested, who's your role model?
Oh, do you know, I really reflected on this one when you first asked me the question pre the interview. And it took me, I was thinking, who is my role model? And not to sound cliched in any way here, but I'd say it's my son. Because my son really, if I think about the sustainability arena, one, it's creating something better for him, which is what we all do when we get into this job, right? It's about how do I create a world that's better for future generations? But also what my son did was help me be better as a person and at my job as well. Because he gives me a purpose, but also he challenges me. So he challenges me to see things through a different lens, to be a better person. And I think through my journey of, being in sustainability, coming out of my career to have my son and going back in, he really made me rethink how to be more successful in what I did. So, yeah, I think, he keeps me on my toes in a positive way.
Shout out to your son. And for people listening in, you might be thinking, okay, I'm here. I really want a career. I want to be the next ESG director. I want to be in that boardroom. What's your advice for someone wanting that career?
I think you have to have passion. I think you have to be really passionate. I think you have to be incredibly resilient. There are ups and downs in many jobs. I think sustainability at times can feel quite tough. And I think you have to be resilient when things don't go your way, but also celebrate the successes that you do have, because you will have them. But most importantly, you have to stay true to what you believe in. And that's really important, because that moral compass of, am I doing the right thing? And the right thing by what your values and your purpose are, but also, most importantly, am I doing the right thing for this business? Because that's your job, to come in and do the right thing for the business. And if you can stay by that ethos of doing the right thing for the business, then you can ride out those really difficult conversations and those highs and those lows of your career. And when I was ever faced with a difficult conversation or a difficult decision, and it might not have gone in my favour, it might not have gone in someone else's favour, I always sat there and asked myself, is this decision the right thing for the business? It might be painful, I might not be well liked, but is it the right thing for the business? And that's what guided me through a lot of difficult times.
Amelia, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.